Hi everyone, in this video I would like to talk about translations of the Bible and how you go about picking one. So obviously we read the Bible in English. If you're part of King's Church at least, I imagine you typically choose to read the Bible in English. And it wasn't written in English. I assume most of us know that, but just for clarity's sake, the New Testament written in Koine Greek, the Old Testament predominantly written in ancient Hebrew with a few small sections written in Aramaic. The vast majority of us will not know any of those languages. I have a small amount of ancient Hebrew and Koine Greek, which is useful to me as a preacher and pastor, but I don't have a lot. I wouldn't want to claim I could pick up the original text and just read it. I can kind of work through it very, very, very slowly. Most of us, me included, have to trust the translators. And we do, and that's a good thing to do. They are godly men and women who have worked hard at learning the languages and then worked hard at translations. We should trust them. But on the other hand, we're probably all aware that there are multiple translations, and sometimes they say slightly different things, sometimes quite different things. They're most of the time slightly different things, so it might alter our interpretation. And we might be thinking, how do I pick one? What do I think about this? How do I make sure I've got one? Well, I've got a few comments to make. I was hoping to show you a few translations when I first thought about doing this video, but we've had to pack all my books up because there's lots of building work going on in our home, so I'm not going to be able to show you them, but you should hopefully be able to follow at least what I'm saying. But the most important point at the start, and I'll reiterate this at the end, is that you should get and use a translation that you will use. The one that makes you read the Bible is the best translation of the Bible. So I will recommend particular translations as being particularly good in my mind, but the one that makes you read the Bible is the best translation of the Bible for you right now. For all being aware of how it works and how it sits and what other things are out there, it can be very helpful. So, how do you pick a translation? There is a spectrum. Sometimes people talk about kind of more literal and less literal translations. That's can be a bit confusing because the word literal is doing some slightly slippery work in that phrase. The formal terms for them would be that there are formal equivalence translations, formal equivalence, which means that they are trying to make the English equivalent to the original language word by word, typically, while still trying to make sentences in English that make sense in English, because other languages have different orders in sentences. You can't literally translate each word. It wouldn't work as something we'd be able to read and follow. And then the spectrum runs from formal equivalence through to dynamic equivalence, which is where trying to translate thought by thought rather than word by word, or sentence by sentence rather than word by word. So trying to say, what does this mean, rather than just what does this say, what does this mean, and then translate that into good English. So both of those, it's not that the word for word doesn't require the translator to do interpretive work. The translator is always interpreting the Bible. Translation is interpretation. But different philosophy of translation in what's called a formal equivalent, sometimes called a word for word, and a dynamic equivalent, sometimes called a thought for thought. Both can be helpful, but it does start to explain why different Bibles look differently. So of the generally out there and read Bibles, the New American Standard Bible is probably the most formal equivalent one out there. It is very close in that sense to the original text in the vast majority of cases. Can be quite difficult to read the English. Doesn't, in my opinion, tend to manage to hold the beauty of the Bible in the way that some other translations, I suppose, particularly the King James, but some other translations do. Then there's the English Standard Version, also a word for word. That's the one that we use for preaching at King's Church, which, in my opinion, actually does a nice balance between being quite close to the original languages but still preserving the kind of beauty of the English language translation of it, just to make the Bible feel beautiful to listen to. Some people find those sentences hard to read. Personally, I don't quite get that, but lots of people say it, so it must be a thing. I think the ESV is actually quite easy to read in terms of its English, but I do think it uses English in ways that sometimes we're not so used to if we don't read very much, certainly. And then moving away from the kind of formal equivalents more to like dynamic equivalence ones would be something like, probably the next one down would be something like the Christian Standard Bible, fairly recent. They haven't done an anglicised one yet with English spellings. But I quite like that. I think that's quite a helpful translation, trying to do a kind of thought for thought thing, but I think captures often what the Greek and the Hebrew is getting at quite well, and they make translation decisions in ways that personally would kind of fit with our theology at King's Church and would fit with what we understand those particular words to mean on several places that might be a little bit more disputed. Then you have something like the NIV, which is probably a little bit more down the spectrum. We're in Thought for Thought now, but kind of a little bit more down the spectrum away from the original languages. Though still, to say that, still very close in some ways to the original languages. Definitely a Thought for Thought translation. Certainly the New International Version, the most popular translation out there. It's what I imagine most people regularly use. And so there's power because you'll know how the things sound. You'll know what the phrases are. You'll have memorized parts of it. I'm not super keen on it. Partly because I think different translations can be helpful to our heads, to shock us into interpretation, to shock us into understanding what the text is saying. Partly because the original 1984 translation I think was pretty good. And the most recent, I think it's 2011, but I might be wrong, translation, not in my personal opinion so good, made a number of decisions which I think are not that helpful, particularly kind of removal of language that makes it clear where Jesus is in the Old Testament. It makes the Old Testament hard to read. So not so keen on that. And then of course it's complicated because they're all sold as NIV. You buy a new one, it'll be the most recent one. But your NIV at home might well be in 1984. The ESV has also gone through a few iterations. The CSB isn't the latest one of those either. This happens and can be a confusing thing because it means they're not always exactly the same. It's good that people keep checking their translations, but the changes can be complicated. And then you move down the spectrum further and you find what we might call something a little bit more like a paraphrase. Certainly the Thought for Thought has gone a bit further, something like the Contemporary English Version or the New Living Translation, which are helpful for thinking about different English ways to frame stuff. And if you find them good to read, that's great, but quite a way away from the original text. And then further down the line, you might find something like The Message, which is written as a deliberate paraphrase, doesn't claim to be a translation, or The Passion, which does claim to be a translation, but still translated by one person and a little bit more of a paraphrase. Both of which can be helpful, can be quite fun, but we should put them in the right place. They are not technical translations of the Bible, and they work very well sat alongside one as someone's description of how they would understand and interpret and translate those phrases. Now I would say check all of this stuff out online. There's websites like Bible Gateway where you can go through loads of them and look at them all. Why not do it? And I would generally recommend, like I said at the start, use the one you'll use. Read the one that actually means you'll read the Bible. But if you're thinking about studying the Bible at all, and I think it'd be great if all of us did, then try and get your hand on a more formally equivalent one. I particularly recommend the English Standard Version because it's the one we use for preaching, like I say, at King's Church. But you will find comparing that to the translation that you perhaps more normally read, as you're just kind of reading the Bible day by day, it can be a helpful thing in thinking, oh, that's a little bit nearer the original text, even if I find these sentences harder to read. Sitting them alongside each other can be helpful. And like I say, lots and lots of electronic tools out there for free. There are, Bible Gateway is the most famous. The ESV Online works very nicely, but does only give you just the ESV. If you think you'd like to dig at the original languages, which can be a little bit dangerous if you don't quite know what you're looking at, then Step Bible from Tyndale House is gold. But otherwise, have a look at these things. Why not compare some translations? It doesn't mean the truth's somewhere in the middle. That's not quite how it works. But you start to get a sense for maybe what words mean, how words are used, that sort of thing. Can be really helpful. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Got any questions about that? Drop me a comment underneath or get in touch with me through Church Suite. Love to talk more about it.